Chris Rackliffe, thank you so much for making the time to sit down and chat with me. I'm really glad you're here.
I'm so grateful to be here, Lara. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed reading your book, and I feel like I got to know you through reading it. A lot of
Yes,
personal stories in there, and I always think that's great. It's so relatable. So,
thank
lots
you.
I want to ask you. We had someone on not too long ago to do a little intro on attachment theory and what is attachment. And a lot of your book and work centers on one of the attachment styles, which is anxious attachment. So, I thought we could start from there, maybe your take on attachment in general and specifically on anxious attachment.
Sure, absolutely. So, for those listening and watching, attachment theory is a branch of psychology that explores how our experiences, especially our relationships with our parents and caregivers during childhood, impact the ways in which we show up in our adult relationships, especially romantic ones.
Mm,
So there's a spectrum from insecure to secure. No one is absolutely insecure. No one is absolutely secure. Very important for folks to understand that attachment styles are not fixed, they are dynamic, they're ever evolving, which
mm,
is a good thing. We can use that to our advantage in order to move to a more secure place on the attachment spectrum. Now, there are four styles: anxious, avoidant, disorganized, which is a combination of anxious and avoidant, and secure. Now, I like to, just as a quick refresher for folks, describe the attachment styles in terms of how they manage two polarities. One of
yeah.
those polarities is independence, the other polarity is dependence. Now, if you're at the extremes, so if you're hyper independent, you are avoidant. If you're hyper dependent to the point of codependency, loss of self, putting other people on a pedestal, self abandonment, you are anxious. Now, secure folks know how to operate in terms of managing both of those extremes. So they are fluid between being independent and dependent. They can manage both a relationship with self and a relationship with others with
Mm,
relative ease. Disorganized does extreme pendulum swings back and forth between either extreme, hyper independent, codependent.
mm,
And you can see why that becomes a bit unpredictable and is the most unstable of the attachment styles. That's just a quick refresher, though. But yes, I focus on the anxious attachment style because that was my truth. I mean, you read a lot of the traumas, a lot of the big T stuff that
mm.
happened to me in my life that led to me developing an anxious approach to relationships. And now, in the work I'm doing as a coach for people with an anxious attachment style, I'm just playing the role of the healing companion I wish I would have had on my own healing journey and passing along what I've learned along the way to growing more secure myself.
Mm.
I used to consider myself about 75% anxious, maybe about 25% secure. Obviously, those numbers are not absolutes. Now I consider myself probably about 75% secure, about 25% anxious. So those have flipped. I'm not immune to experiencing fear and doubt and worry and anxiety, but my relationship with those feelings and with my nervous system and body have changed
Mm.
drastically.
So much good stuff there. First of all, thank you for taking us through the four quadrants. We definitely need that as a base for this conversation. And I really appreciated the framing of dependence and independence. I think that's really helpful because sometimes it's hard to figure out where we are. And also, so important what you said about us not being all one thing. I like this idea of thinking about it in a sort of in percentages.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, all great frameworks for those of us who want to check in on, what our attachment style might be.
Thank you.
Yeah, super helpful. And so since our focus today and your focus, the people you're calling in to serve, and I think that's beautiful as well. I think many of us we are called make meaning from the traumas that we experience in our life. Like I think the highest level of healing those traumas is finding meaning and helping others. And you were certainly called to do that for particularly anxious style. So maybe we can delve a little bit more into how do we know if we have the anxious style of attachment? Where does it come from? What kind of developmental history would lead to that? Some of those beginner questions.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So, anxious attachers, I've spoken to thousands of folks who experience anxious attachment across the globe on 6 continents, all but Antarctica.
Hmm.
And in those conversations, I have heard some of the most harrowing and heartbreaking stories that you can imagine. That said, the trauma that creates anxious attachment varies widely, but the feelings that the child or the person takes away from those experiences tends to be somewhat universal. So it's not so much about the experience as it is what the child takes away from it and how they feel as a result. This is also important to note because healing work is not about blaming parents. A lot of times, more often than not, your parents were doing the absolute best that they could for you and giving you everything that they had to give. And it can be simultaneously true that that was not enough for you, that that
Hmm.
did not make you feel safe and seen and understood and heard, and that creates trauma. I define trauma as any disconnection that overwhelms our ability to cope. And those two variables are really important to consider because it can really take any form of disconnection. Of course, that can be big T trauma, big life altering events that occur, like a lot of what I experienced in
Hmm.
terms of having parents divorce when I was 2, being sexually abused by my own sister at 5 years old when she was 14, my mom experiencing alcoholism and being an alcoholic, her moving away when I was 8 years old, going from seeing her 2 to 3 times a month to 2 to 3 times a year. That is real abandonment. It was bewildering for my 8-year-old brain to understand. I couldn't understand why she would choose to move that far away. It was heartbreaking for my little heart that was
Yeah.
still trying to understand the world. I came out of the closet at 14 years old. My mom passed away from her alcoholism at 18, and I spent those 10 years from the ages of 8 to 18 in this cycle of pining after her, longing to see her, long, hours long conversations on the phone, back when long distance minutes were a thing. Kind of
Mm.
dating myself there, but
I'm with you.
point, yeah, I hear you. Yeah. Point being, I experienced a lot of the big T stuff and I felt abandoned in a lot of ways as a result. That's what I took away from it. Those were the moments of disconnection that I experienced. Now, the other part of the definition, anything that overwhelms your ability to cope, it helps people to understand why childhood trauma in particular is so common. We are still trying to understand the world. We are
Mhm.
dependent oftentimes on the people that we are experiencing trauma with, which can be a double edged sword. And it's overwhelming our ability to cope because we have not formulated that ability yet.
Absolutely.
And trauma actually prevents the formulation of it from occurring. So it's really important for folks to understand too that trauma, again, is not always these big, grand, sweeping events. Trauma can be little t, it can be moments that accumulate over time of disconnection, being invalidated, being told to finish everything on your plate, even though your belly is full. You're not
Mm.
hungry anymore. Being told to go to your room if you're going to cry,
Mm.
essentially it being implied or implicit that you should be seen and not heard, being told you should become a doctor or a lawyer when that is not your passion or calling. That is also invalidation.
Mm.
And so it helps people to understand just how widespread trauma is
Yeah.
and why we tend to have, as anxious folks, I'm speaking to them specifically now, why we tend to experience abandonment as a result. We have sensitive hearts, we have big feelings. Oftentimes, those expressions have been created from the traumatic experiences that we've gone through. And yet, some of that predates the trauma too.
Mm. Oh,
And
that's interesting.
yeah, I see a lot of that with clients. Of course, it takes the form of abuse and neglect and really, again, harrowing stories, but it
Yeah.
can also be just not having a parent that really understood you or really
Yeah.
cared about your feelings or was plugged into that.
As a parent, I'm always careful when we get into the parenting thing that parents know that you don't have to get it right all the time, right? We don't
Correct.
always have to be 100% attuned. It's natural to make mistakes. But what we're talking about is, you know, consistent non attunement where you're really not relating authentically with your child. And I like what you're saying. You know, it is important to realize that it doesn't have to be the kind of traumas that we often think about, you know, like a parent leaving like yours did. It can be leaving in other ways, like not connecting and not, and, Gabor does such good work with, you know, talking about how not being a being, not being able to be authentic, um, being shut off from that, which I think is kind of what you're speaking to with like you can't be a doctor, you or you have to be a doctor, you can't be yourself, you can't be gay.
Hmm.
There's a part of us that closes off or is overwhelmed, and that can result in trauma response.
Absolutely. Amen to all of that. Yes.
And I'm curious, I'm curious about what you said about kind of that predisposition, because we could imagine some nervous systems going, okay, you don't want me. You don't want me as I am. I'm just going to cut myself off, avoidant style, survival skill. These are all
Mhm.
survival skills that the
Yes.
especially young organism needs.
Ooh,
Or
yes.
right, right. Like this is actually a good thing at the time. It's a survival thing. It's later. You're going to tell us why we would want this later and why we might want to work on it. But at that time, we need it to survive. Or in your case, some might have a predisposition for, but I need you, like fulfill me. And that's that more anxious, where are you response. Am I kind of getting it right there?
Yes, absolutely. You know, it's hard to say whether or not my own sensitivity predated the trauma that I experienced because it started happening when I was so young.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that said, for all that I can remember from my earliest memories, I've always had a lot of feelings. And so, sure, was some of that created by the traumas that I had already experienced by that point? Likely. But was I already a sensitive child? Probably on some level. It
You're
probably
probably
only exacerbated the sensitivity for me.
yeah, it sounds like you were picking up on a lot of what was going on in your environment as well.
Yes, as many children do.
Yeah. They
Lots of
have
kids,
to.
they're far more intuitive than we give them credit for. You know, they really do understand, maybe not logically, but they feel what's going on.
That's a really important point. Is they're actually uh, they are evolved for that because they are so in need of an adult for survival. So we are really evolved as children to be on the lookout, um, because we're so sensitive. We
Yes,
are and so dependent. Yeah.
so dependent. We need people to take care of us in order to actually survive. And that is the number one goal of the nervous system, of the
That's right.
body, is
That's right.
survival. We are wired for that. Belonging is a sub goal of that, is an objective that helps us to survive. Of course, we're wired for that too. So it's important for people to understand, though, that mating and procreating is a form of survival.
Mhm.
Connection, being a part of the tribe, belonging is a sub goal of survival. Everything serves the goal of survival to the
Mm.
body and to
Yeah.
the nervous system. And yet, as you mentioned, what helps us to survive prevents us from being able to thrive as an adult. And I
Mm.
also think it's important to note that sometimes attachment develops, insecure attachment develops in adulthood.
Right.
And it's not always something that originates in childhood, although I would say for probably about 9 out of 10 people, it is. They can map pretty directly to one or a series of experiences, memories, relationships that helped them to develop this way of coping, or that led to them developing this way of coping. But as an adult too, if you experience enough instability, a lack of safety, a lack of attunement, or people that understand you, yes, of course you're going to develop an insecure approach to your relationships. The body is so intuitive and smart, it's constantly learning.
Mm.
And because of that, we can train it through new data to expect more safety and to become more secure. The opposite can also happen if you're not surrounded by the right people for you, people that are aligned values wise, that actually are secure. We're always picking up from the nervous system regulation or dysregulation of others. So keep that in mind too. You go through enough experiences as an adult. Oftentimes, those reinforce what already happened in childhood.
Mm.
But if you made it through childhood relatively unscathed, perhaps you had a little bit more of the little t trauma, not so much big T. Again, it's always about your response to it. But that said, if you felt mostly secure, again, not thinking in absolutes, but then go into adulthood and have several relationships that chip away at your sense
Mm.
of safety and self-worth, yeah, of course you're going to start to get anxious, look at your phone all the time, want reassurance and validation, start to become dysregulated, which is driving all of that behavior.
Yeah, so I'd love to hear more of those signs for folks who are wondering if they are anxiously attached. What might they see in their behavior or their thinking?
The number one trigger I hear about from folks all over the world, and that I felt myself, is a lack of communication.
Okay.
Usually this happens through texting. So let's say you message someone, or you haven't heard from them in response, or you just haven't heard from them in a couple of days. That lack of consistency, that lack of communication is the number one trigger. Now, of course, it would be. Communication is essential for relationships. However, the response to it demonstrates dysregulation. There's an overreaction, there's an over mobilization of energy in the body. So you can tell if you're feeling anxious based on your ability to focus. Typically, there's a lack of focus. You're hyper focused on, hypersensitive to, hyper vigilant about that person, that relationship. You're emotionally monitoring what's happening, oftentimes indirectly. So you might stalk them
Hmm.
on social media, look at their tagged posts. You might see if they've looked at your Instagram stories, or if they're on Snap Maps, or if they've shared their location with you, where they are. You're going to gather data, but it's all going to be indirect regarding clarity about where you stand with this person.
Oh,
That is
yeah.
also problematic, of course, but it's very indirect. A lot of this is characterized by protest behavior, of course. Protest behavior are adult tantrums in one form or another, acting out, being hostile, withdrawing, keeping score, trying to make someone jealous, like posting a sexy selfie to your Instagram story, like, ooh, did they watch it? Are they going to look at it? Trying to entice someone sexually. Anxious attachers use physical intimacy to try to enmesh with others.
Okay.
Codependency is also a core component of anxious attachment. So if you have described in your romantic history the following: "Ugh, I always put someone on a pedestal. This person is amazing. Why can't I be with them?" Even though your body is telling you you do not feel safe with them, which is inherently not amazing.
Mm.
Um, if you feel like you lose yourself in your relationships, also a sign of codependency and therefore anxious attachment. So if you self abandon to the point of stopping your hobbies and interests and goals and passions, and one of the early signs of codependency is not making plans with friends in order to make yourself available for somebody else. If you're noticing a lot of these, yeah, you probably have an anxious attachment style. Fear of abandonment is big, feeling like you're too much or not good enough, withholding communication. So
Hmm.
for instance, not asking for reassurance directly because you feel like you're needy if you do so. These are all signs of anxious attachment.
This is so helpful. I'm sure there are many people going down that list right now or
Check,
like
check,
being
check.
like, well, they,
Rumination too.
mm,
Overthinking is a really, really, really big one. And by the way, rumination equals dysregulation. You're going up into your mind because you do not feel safe in your body.
yes, it's that anxious energy getting locked in the mind and the rumination and distorted, thinking, distorted cognition. Excellent.
Yeah,
Yeah. I feel my stress more in my body, but and have less of that, and some people feel it more in the thinking. That
absolutely.
was super helpful. I really related to that idea of um you know, feeling that neediness. Um, and then and instead of directly asking for that reassurance from the partner, like I'm feeling a little needy right now, um, doing all those. And now, of course, and I'm sure you're familiar with that recent book, What the Anxious Generation. We
Mm,
have more ways to be anxious and to really feed into this style with the social media.
yes, and that's an important consideration here too. And we're living in a very interesting time where we have so much information at our fingertips. A lot of that information is not helpful. It is fear based. It
Yeah.
causes more dysregulation. Also, we have a lot of ways of connecting, but connections right now, relationships, are quite frankly very shallow.
Yeah.
And so it's natural for an organism, a human being, to have a more anxious approach to relating to others right now in particular.
Yeah.
So I always remind my clients nothing happens outside of context. Relationships are always contextual. So you also have to look at what's happening around you that's informing your body's response
Mm.
and your system's response. What from the environment is hitting the energy that you're carrying with you from the past? What is it
Mm.
bringing up in you? Sometimes that is at a cultural or societal level. That's kind of an underpinning, a kind of bubbling over that happens unconsciously below the surface. We don't even feel it. It's just there. It's a festering kind of anxiety and fear and worry and existential dread and doubt, Sunday scaries type of stuff.
Yes. Yes.
So, yes, that is important to name too, because we're just living in very triggering times.
Yes. And I'm wondering, does the anxious style tend to go for the avoidant style? And what kind of loop are we getting ourselves into there? Because I can imagine even if the partner isn't avoidant, they might start acting kind of avoidant, feeling this enmeshment.
Absolutely. Anxious attachers and avoidant attachers tend to pair up. A lot of that has to do with the fact that they both remind each other of key relationships or experiences that
Yeah.
they've had. So
Yeah.
the enmeshment that the anxious person is seeking reminds the avoidant typically of a parental relationship where there was a lot of pressure, a lot of expectations, where they needed their child to rely on. And in reverse, the avoidance distance and invalidation emotionally, their detachment, their dismissive approach reminds anxious attachers of the abandonment that they have experienced in one form or another.
Yeah.
They also confirm each other's core beliefs.
That's right. Right.
The avoidant attacher, after the kind of early sparks flying period at the beginning, because the physical chemistry between the two is very intense at the
Mm.
beginning. It's like it's a pop song basically. Two people meet, it's heaven, it's teenage dream type stuff, it's love story Taylor Swift type stuff, it's fairy tale storybook type stuff. And a lot of that is because it is too good to be true. they're both actually allowing the enmeshment to occur at the beginning.
Uh-huh.
The anxious person is seeking it. The avoidant person is allowing it because they do not yet feel manipulated or controlled, or they haven't yet reached their emotional threshold, which is lower, that
Mhm.
they can tolerate. But when the switch up happens, when the avoidant pulls away, which in my experience personally and professionally will typically happen somewhere between the 4 to 12 week mark.
Very helpful.
Obviously that's a big window, but it depends on the person
Yeah.
and their tolerance, and also they're not 100% avoidant either.
Right.
So they might have aspects of security that they've had modeled for them that they've learned or picked up on along the way too. So their tolerance is going to be dependent based on that.
Mhm.
But they will pull away, and when they do, it will send the anxious partner into a tailspin.
Yeah.
It is incredibly triggering. It is rewounding for us in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
It hits at that core wound of abandonment. And our strategy relationally is lean in, try harder, work at it.
Yes.
And yet that's not always the solution. In fact, learning to appreciate and value the space that the avoidant is providing to you as well is
Hmm.
critical for an anxious attacher to grow more independent and come back to a more balanced place in the center here between independence and dependence.
Ah, that's lovely. Like, yeah, we can learn something from them. And if we can take that breath, right, take that moment and allow for that learning, like, oh, maybe there is something here about how this person works
Yes,
in relationship I can learn from for more
yes.
balance.
That can
That,
be the beauty of that kind of dynamic. The
yeah.
avoidant person can learn to be vulnerable and have that received very
Mm,
well because anxious attachers are hyper attuned to others, of course, at the expense of their own feelings. But we have nothing but empathy for others. That's also an issue. But that said, the avoidant person can learn from the anxious person can learn from the avoidant person, but that must be the goal. If
yeah,
that's not the
right,
goal, then that's not going to happen. And
right.
oftentimes there is this creation of a threatening dynamic, like the other person's the problem. He's emotionally unavailable or she's avoidant. At the end of the day, sure, yes, they might be engaging in that strategy or approach. However, cultivating empathy for the avoidant is incredibly important
Yeah.
because they brain scans of avoidant and anxious folks are relatively similar. What that shows
Wow.
us is that they are freaking out inside.
Mm,
We externalize as anxious attachers, avoidance internalize. That goes back to the independent dependent dynamic that we set up this conversation with, those polarities. And neither approach is healthy or sustainable. And both folks have experienced trauma in order to develop those adaptations, those maladaptive approaches often to
yes.
relationships. And so it's important as an anxious person, if you're listening to this, to not villainize the avoidant. You know, they just have a different approach.
That is
They have
so
also
spot on.
experienced trauma, and it's not fair to make them the villain. They are not the threat. They have a different approach. And if you take a step back, learn to regulate yourself, learn to diversify your relationships emotionally, which we can dive into. Emotional
Oh,
diversification
yeah.
is essential for building a sense of independence as an anxious attacher. But if you can learn to do that, again, that time, that space holds tremendous value for you. You can fill that time with a number of different things, a number of different people, and oftentimes you need to use it to come back to self. That is what your emotions are trying to tell you. They're calling you back in to your container.
Mm,
Feelings are not facts, but they are directionally, informationally helpful. Those two directions are, and oftentimes are a combination of the two, self and other. I need to come back into myself. I need to be with myself. I need to self regulate. I need to understand what's happening here. I need to find language for describing this experience.
mm.
Where is it manifesting? What is it bringing up from my past? Why?
So
What
you're
about this
saying,
is triggering for me?
yeah, so when we have those big feelings, trying instead of what we might be inclined to, that person is horrible and they never give me attention and they don't call me back. And if we can, to pause and say, oh, what's happening here? And
Exactly.
look inward for what we might learn about ourselves. And of course, that doesn't mean if someone isn't treating us right that we should stay with them.
Correct.
And there's information that we can gain about our own selves from the feelings.
Yeah, I I think it's always important to come back into your container first to be able to describe what is happening, to find
Mm,
the language and to self-regulate. When you are triggered and you become dysregulated, either overreacting or underreacting, fight or flight, freeze or fawn responses, the blood in your brain is rushing to the center of your brain, to the limbic system, to the amygdala. And what that means is it's rushing away from the prefrontal cortex, from having language to describe what's going on,
yeah.
and from being able to have a calm conversation with someone about what it is that you need. So if you rush to co regulation, if you rush to talk to somebody else about what is going on, then you can actually really damage the relationship because you're approaching someone from a triggered, dysregulated place and nobody responds well to that energy, no matter how secure they are. They're going to be put immediately on the defensive, and the result is likely not going to be what you desire.
Yeah.
So that can also be a form of protest behavior. You're acting out, you're acting impulsively, like a child would, who does not know how to be with their feelings. Now, this is not about blame, it's about accountability and recognizing that's a pattern of behavior that you might be
Yes.
engaging in.
Yes.
That is important for healing and finding a different approach. Self regulation, find the language, be with the feeling, soothe, come back down to a more regulated place. Again, not absolute. You don't have to be completely calm. That's not what regulation is about.
Right.
It's not about ignoring your feelings, but be with it. That reaction again is calling you back in. Then, when you have language to describe what has happened, when you understand what it is that you desire, what the unmet need is that you want to ask directly to be met, go to that person, talk to them, bring them in to your experience. Now, even when we communicate from the most compassionate, most inclusive place, that does not guarantee that somebody else is going to receive that.
Boy, do we need to hear that one again and again.
But that's also not why we communicate.
That's right.
The important part is that you are honoring the experience that you are having.
Yeah.
And if you do this with regularity, and perhaps it's best to practice with people who are safe and consistent with you first, but if you do that, you can work your way up to talking to folks that maybe are a bit more intimidating or that you don't feel as safe with.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you will understand I can do this. You'll build up the confidence and the skill set. You'll develop that muscle that you need in order to open up to others. Of course, it's scary, but you can learn it. That is a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the work that I do with clients, modeling emotional regulation, receiving with attunement, helping to model effective and assertive and compassionate communication to
Mm.
them, setting boundaries around their values. But yes, you can do this. It's always both, though, self regulation, co regulation, not one or the other.
Mm. Yeah, a lot of good insights there. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
We, we kind of talked about the cycle, and I think it's important to say that the the reason that we might see this pattern again and again, a, confirming beliefs, and b, it is normal of trauma response, that what the system wants to do is to keep doing it until it turns out differently. So it's
Yes.
totally normal to find ourselves in these patterns, and I definitely want to get to, which we've started to, how do we start to break some of these patterns? How do we start to move from that 75% anxious to that 25 where you're at now?
Yeah. It's complex. It is. But ultimately, the foundation for growing more secure is nervous system regulation by far. I look at the cycle of anxious attachment as having three defined phases. It's interesting because they're both causes and effects
Hmm.
of one another. And those include abandonment, codependency, and trauma. They're all a form of each other. And it's interesting because the cycle can work both directions.
Hmm.
Now, at the center of that cycle, in the middle of that circle, is dysregulation. Dysregulation is caused by all of it and is the underlying perpetuating factor of why it continues to occur. So, if you really want to grow more secure, you cannot continue to just use cognitive techniques. You will only be able to get so far that way.
Yeah.
This is why many of the people that reach out to me for coaching have they've already tried therapy for years and years and they've made good progress, but they have not broken the cycle yet
Hmm.
because they just one keep talking about and therefore reinforcing neural pathways about the same traumatic events that happened to them
Yes.
without actually addressing the underlying dysregulation that occurred
Yes.
because of those events. And
Hmm.
so that is the biggest gap for folks when it comes to healing. We know this to be true intuitively in our body because when you're triggered, it's not a cognitive experience. It
That's
is
right.
somatic and physiological, it is felt. So you can't think your way out of your feelings or think your way to being more regulated. In fact, that oftentimes is a reflection of being dysregulated. Again, rumination is dysregulation. We're coming out of the
Beautiful.
body and into the mind. So that is the biggest piece. And I want people to understand, and I'm sure you've talked about this extensively on the show, that nervous system regulation is not complicated. It is about asking yourself, what is it that I need right now?
Hmm.
What is it that would make me feel connected and cared for at this moment? Now, part of that is about cultivating presence with whatever emotional experiences you are having. And some of the techniques for doing that include meditation, yoga, breath work. I mean, a lot of alternative or Eastern techniques
Hmm.
really help with reconnecting with the body and being present with those experiences that we have emotionally.
Yeah.
And then another aspect of nervous system regulation is building up tolerance for stress
That's right.
for the future. So, one of the best ways that I found to do this is cold exposure because you're practicing the body's stress response and breathing through
Yes.
that, and you're being present with it. And those are some of the initial techniques that I use. I assign a daily nervous system regulation practice to my clients on day one. They do it
Wonderful.
every day. It's about a half an hour of work every day for 3 months.
Is it different for each client, or you have a system that you?
Nope, it's always the same. It's
Okay.
breath work, meditation, cold exposure, body movement, hydration.
Yeah.
You got to get the basics down.
You really have to. You really have to.
Yes, breathing,
It's amazing
hydrating,
how
drinking
folks want to
water. Yeah,
skip
it
it.
sounds
Sunlight.
counterintuitive or simple.
Yeah.
Sunlight, yes, that's a part of the body movement. I ask clients to get outside for 15 minutes a day,
Yeah.
just walking.
I mean, you need it for your circadian rhythm, and if your circadian rhythm is off, you're gonna be dysregulated. So we
Yes,
we
and
gotta get those physiological things down.
absolutely. That is the
Yeah.
number one thing. But there
Yeah.
are other factors that obviously I'm addressing with clients. Forgiveness is big. I know not
Mm,
every mental health practitioner agrees with that. My
that's
take on
okay.
forgiveness is that it's for you, it's not for them. It has nothing to do with them. It's about you doing what you can to gouge out the gunk to try to experience catharsis. And no, you don't even need their participation in this.
That's right.
I
Yeah.
talked about this a little bit in It's Good to See Me Again, my first book. There are a couple of visualizations in there. There's a root pulling visualization. Uh, Letters of forgiveness, again, are really important just for closure and clarity. We carry so much with us that we really have not put an end to, that we have not, in terms of completion, allowed to come to its close.
Mhm.
And when you have all of this unresolved stuff, of course, it's going to get in the way of you connecting with other people now. That's part of the issue. So, catharsis and clarity are really important, looking at patterns of
Mhm.
behavior. How are you coping? In what ways are you coping? How do you want to cope differently? The accountability of coaching is really important for people to understand too, Because it's not just sessions. If you have a coach, a good coach,
Yeah.
they're going to offer a program that is not just sessions based. So I've got worksheets in the program, there's messaging support. I'm with you every day throughout the journey together,
Yeah.
because what I'm modeling for folks without them realizing it is safety, a home base, stability, consistency. And I'm teaching their nervous system non-verbally to expect that in the future, to know that they can come to someone and they'll be greeted with acceptance and kindness and compassion and openness and curiosity. That's a big part of it too. Safe relationships are essential. If you were wounded in unsafe relationships, you heal through safe ones.
Hmm.
That includes with yourself. You need to be a safe container for yourself, and many of us are not. We have abdicated our seat of personal power and responsibility. We don't even take care of our fundamental needs, like Maslow's lowest hierarchy of needs:
Yeah.
nutrition or food, hydration, shelter, before we even go up into the need to belong and to love and to be a part of the social structure and fabric of society. You need to get those down. Many
Yeah.
people have vitamin deficiencies they need to address. This is just about taking care of your temple.
Yeah.
Now,
Absolutely.
emotional diversification is something I mentioned earlier, and I do want to come back to that now.
Yes.
Diversification is a concept I borrowed from the world of finance or wealth management. It is a risk mitigation strategy for ensuring that you're invested in a variety of different sectors of the market, types of investments, so that if one or multiple of those sectors are hit, they take a downturn, that overall you will be protected.
Hmm.
I actually used this example in another conversation recently, and it's kind of corny, but bear with me. For my Harry Potter fans out there, this is a dark metaphor, so bear with me. I'm not a Voldemort fan, but please know this is an interesting metaphor. It's kind of like Horcruxes.
Okay.
So you're taking some of your ability to connect and you're spreading it out in different relationships so that if one of those areas is impacted significantly, you're protected, you don't die.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
it is sort of like a Horcrux in that way. You're protected.
Yeah.
And that said, there's such a cornucopia of connection available to us. And yes, a romantic partnership is amazing and wonderful and can feel really great and add a lot to our lives. But it is additive.
Yes. Yeah.
A, a romantic partner is not the end all be all. They cannot be the parent that you never had, the exes that your exes could not be for you.
Yes.
They don't deserve that projected onto them. That can also be really painful and a form of invalidation because you're not seeing them. You're using them.
Hmm.
You're using them to fulfill a purpose for you, which is to resolve trauma. You're not really seeing them for who they are. You're using them.
That's powerful. That's really powerful because there's some people, and you talk about this in the book, and I want to talk about long lasting change, um, and long lasting change is hard, and um, and there's some folks who it's hard to change for themselves, who might hear that and say that that actually gives me reason to change because I don't want to do that to someone.
Mm, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, we don't often stop to reflect on how we impact other people.
Hmm.
There's a saying that's been circulating on social media, and I wish I could attribute the original creator, but it's something to the effect of you need to heal so that you don't bleed on people who didn't wound you.
Mm, yeah.
And we project until we end up grounding that energy and healing that part of us. It's not about absolute. You might not fully heal from it, and that's okay. It can
Yeah.
also be incredibly valuable in informing who you've become as a result of your experiences, and that's not a bad thing.
Right.
So, at the end of the day, you have to look in the mirror and take accountability for the ways that you are showing up that are perpetuating your pain, and realizing that you have invalidated others by expecting them to play a role for you can be deeply challenging and unsettling for folks, but it is often true. I know I was guilty of this. You know, a lot of the people I dated early on in my life, throughout my 20s even, I didn't really see them. I didn't care really about who they were. I just wanted them to fill the role of
Mm.
providing for me what was not provided emotionally. And
Yeah.
that was not fair to them. And that was honestly likely why many of them pulled away, and I experienced further abandonment as a result.
Yeah.
You know, I looked in the mirror eventually and just had to say, I'm the common denominator here in all of my experiences. And if the rubber's not meeting the road, you need to do the same. If
Mm.
you are recognizing connections from your childhood into adulthood, how you're showing up romantically versus how you related to your parents, there's
Yeah.
usually some connections there, and you got to address that. And if you need help or support to do it, seek that out, because again, we're social creatures. We don't heal in isolation. We
That's
heal
right.
through safe relationships, and sometimes we need other people to model the skills for us that we didn't pick up elsewhere. It's honestly a tragedy, a travesty, that our modern education system does not prioritize teaching communication skills, relational development,
Yeah.
attunement, nervous system regulation. I mean, these are essential for building relationships with longevity and that help us sustain through the tough periods of life, that build a social fabric for
Yes.
us. And as I remind people all the time, we say it takes a village to raise a child. Why does that stop at 18 years old? It
Yeah.
does not. It takes a village to be a human being.
Yes.
And you need to recognize that you also play a role in who you surround yourself with and the access that you allow other people to have.
Hmm.
Everyone listening to this is a fully formed adult. Take responsibility for the people that you are allowing to exist in your sphere, to have access to you. There's a saying that from Jim Rohn, and it's in It's Good to See Me Again. We're the average of the 5 people that we spend the most time with.
Yeah.
We're also the average of the nervous system regulation present in those 5 people. So if you're not surrounding yourself with people who are stable and consistent and regulated and secure and relatively, of course, more often than not, healthy,
Yeah.
where are you supposed to learn this?
Yes. Absolutely. We heal in relationship. Trauma is relational. So the only way to heal that is in that relationship, in that healing relationship. And it sounds like you're providing that for the folks that you're coaching. You're encouraging them to, as you said, diversify. Don't put everything into one person. um, I'm married, and I say that to myself still. I don't need my husband to be everything. There's some things that I get from my friends, there's some things I get from mentors. No one can
Mm.
be everything for another person. So I think that's a great reminder. And it doesn't have to be everybody. You don't have to take everyone in. Sometimes it's hard. I've definitely had some pretty dysregulated people around me, and it's hard to let those friendships go, especially if they're doing the best that they can. But we have to set boundaries for our own mental health. And sometimes if we don't give give them the whole of kind of the response, if we just remain regulated, they kind of go off anyway, because
Mhm.
they're not getting that reaction that they're habituated to. So just
Absolutely.
lots of good stuff there. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And sometimes, by the way, setting boundaries with those people, or maybe even phasing them out,
Yeah.
allocating less energy to
Yeah.
them, not managing their emotions, not walking on eggshells, not holding back,
Yeah.
that can often be the wake up call, if they so choose, that they need in order to become more regulated.
Yeah.
Sometimes the most loving thing that you can do for someone is release them.
That is well said. That is really well said. I'm curious. I picked up on what you were saying about, the checking in with your clients, and I'm wondering if, because of the tendency for dependency. If there's a phase out that you work with, um, do you tell them when they've graduated or that they could always, that they're ready? Of course, they can always come back for a tune-up, or how does that work? Because that can be a hard part of the coaching relationship or any therapeutic relationship.
Mm. I've never been asked that question before.
I hope
Well
that's
done.
I hope that's a good thing.
It is a good thing. It's important to discuss. All of the programs, the packages that I offer from a coaching standpoint are 12 weeks in length. So it is understood upfront that our work is defined within those 12 weeks.
Yeah.
However, every client is a bit different. Some rely on the messaging components a bit more than others. Some rely more on the sessions. I try to help clients understand that I look at the coaching container as an ongoing conversation between us. So as stuff comes up, don't hold back, but also I'm not going to be breathing down your neck, checking in on you
Good.
multiple
Yeah.
times a week. The max that I will check in on clients, and only if they ask me to, that's also getting them to speak up and ask for what they need, is 2 times a week. I don't check in more than that. If they want to check in more than that, they can. They know that that is available to them, but that is one way, one boundary I've set for myself that can help people to understand, okay, this is not an everyday, all day kind of thing. This is an as needed
Hmm.
messaging container. Now, as we approach the end of the program, some folks do want to keep working with me. That depends on my availability from a coaching standpoint, where I'm at with new clients versus continuation. But generally speaking, about a third of the clients I work with will continue on in some capacity. Typically, that's at a monthly cadence. So they might be moving from I don't do weekly coaching. The max I do is 8 sessions in 12 weeks.
Hmm.
So there is a good amount of breathing room. Roughly, it would be about every 10 days we're meeting, or weekly with a few weeks off here and
Yeah.
there. But if they want to continue, that option is available if I have it to extend to them. And if not, then I can direct them to other places. And ultimately, I got into coaching to help people to make as much progress as possible in the program that I offer. So my hope is that they don't need me
Yeah.
anymore. And that with the techniques that I'm passing along to them, with the regulation, with a lot of the different exercises that I offer clients, with diversifying and getting in a more regulated place, with addressing other stuff like self acceptance, setting
Mm.
boundaries, communicating, that they'll have what they need fundamentally. They might still need to practice it, which is normal. I mean, you're not going to finish all the work in 12 weeks, certainly. But at the end of the day, it is difficult sometimes to let go. But I try to inspire clients to understand you have what you need.
Yeah.
You really do. We can keep going if I have that available, but you do not need to do that necessarily.
I
And
think
that can
that's
also be a
wonderful.
form of codependency too.
Exactly. And I think I appreciate your addressing that, and it it's an important part of the the process together is how we say goodbye, especially if there's been abandonment. And I think that's great about like reducing the cadence because that gives people some, it's not just suddenly I'm gone. So
Yeah.
I imagine that would be very helpful. And you also mentioned, referring to resources, which is excellent. It's important for us to share resources, and not be, for us as coaches, to not be to become that all person either, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And that is something that I've really worked hard to ensure that clients understand. You hold the power, not me.
Yes.
Not me.
Yes.
I hold the space. I've offered you everything I have to offer. Of course, sometimes that space is still desired and maybe even for some necessary for
Yeah.
them because they might not have the support elsewhere. They might
That's
not
right.
have the diversification. And so they do need it,
Yeah.
but not everybody does.
Yeah. Yeah, good point too. I mean, we're all resourced differently. We talked a lot about our inner resources, the
Yeah.
breathing, finding our regulation, and we all have different access to outer resources. And for a time, you might be the only person that someone can talk to. And hopefully through the process, they're learning to develop better relationships and come into touch with some other resources. So it's always important to be aware of where people are at with that. Um,
100%. And I always leave the door open for clients. They can always text me, email me, message me. It's not the end, certainly. I want them, and many do reach out like 6 months later, 12, 18 months later, 2 years,
yeah.
and will say, I'm in a really healthy relationship now. I don't think I would be here if it weren't for you, Chris. I've got
Mm,
multiple clients getting married this fall. So
congratulations.
it's
Yeah.
just, I leave the door open. I want to hear from them, and not just during triggering times.
Yes, I know, we wanna know when you're doing well.
Yes, tell us, please.
Don't just call when things are bad, yes. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's beautiful, so many, success stories. Chris, we covered a lot here in our conversation. Is there anything that I didn't ask you, or a topic that we didn't touch upon that's, that you feel is important to share with the listeners?
I want to talk about shame and the idea of brokenness a little bit here.
Yeah.
I hear from a lot of people around the world. And by the way, I know that's so cliche to hear nowadays on social media. So many people are asking me questions, but literally, I've got 150,000 followers on TikTok. I hear from people from every corner of the world who are in oftentimes their darkest hour,
Mm,
and who unfortunately describe themselves as broken, or what can I do to fix this? Please hear me very clearly if you are watching or listening. You are not broken. You do not require fixing. You might have been conditioned to respond in the ways that you have, and that is okay. But again, those survival impulses and what we do out of protection can often keep us from connection
yeah,
and from thriving. You are not a car, you're not some mechanical object, you're not a robot. You are a human being. You need love and support. And if you did not have that modeled for you, and if you do not have that at your fingertips now, you need to seek it out for yourself and work with someone, find someone that you feel connected to,
yeah.
whose story resonates with you and that you feel seen by, because that safety is essential for healing.
It
You
really
can make
is.
much more progress more quickly than you realize, because healing is not time dependent.
Ooh, important message. I
It's
think
not.
I think that's a really strong one that we leave folks with. I think that is really, really important. Thank you,
Thank you. I
Chris.
appreciate that.
Tell folks who want to work with you, who want to find you on the social media, how can they find you? Where can they get your book? All those great things.
All of my online presences, as I talk about on the very first page of It's Good to See Me Again, are at Cracklife. It's Cracklife with two F's. There's a reason for that. I was literally teased growing up because of that shorthand nickname for me. But Cracklife on Instagram, TikTok. My website is crackliffe.com. On my website and across my social media presences, there are a variety of free resources
Mm.
for you, including blogs like 5 Ways to Heal a Fear of Abandonment, 12 Ways to Make the Anxious Avoidant Dynamic Work,
Mm.
7 Ways to Heal the Anxious Attachment Style. I also have several guides. If you sign up for my newsletter, you'll get my limiting beliefs exercises, as well as my guide for texting for anxious attachers. Again, it's the
Oh,
number one trigger
that's
I
a
hear
great one.
about for folks. So if you go to cracklift.com, in the navigation, you'll see texting guide. You can sign up for that there for free. And then also, I have a healing toolkit for folks. It's a self guided, kind of distilled version of the thousands of hours of coaching I've done. There are 2 workshops that I recorded that are in there.
Wow.
Now, that's almost 7 hours of audio and video content for folks, as well as about 10 worksheets that they can go through in a self guided way
Yeah.
to get to the root here and to also work on their nervous system. The daily practice is included in that. Uh, if you go to the healing tab on my website, you'll see that there. It's called the Anxious Attachment Healing Toolkit. And then, of course, if you're interested in coaching, you can navigate to the coaching tab on my website or go to cracklift.com/coaching. coaching to set up a free consultation.
Wow, so many resources. I'm going to encourage people to pick up your book as well. There are a lot of exercises in it, questions to ask yourself, which we didn't get to, but it's good to leave. There's a lot in the book that we didn't get to, a lot of your story. Folks want to learn more about you. So, this has been a fantastic conversation, Chris. I got so much out of this. Thank you so much for making this time.
Thank you, Lara. I am deeply grateful. Thank you.